Hi, and welcome to our first webcast for Growing Old Around the Globe, a massive open online course out of the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing brought to you by Coursera.org. My name is Ann Shoemaker. I am one of the instructors. Unfortunately, Dr. Sarah Kagan can't join us today. She's traveling. She's in Oklahoma. But we do have the wonderful GJ Melendez-Torres coming to us via the UK. So just a little intro. GJ is a departmental lecturer in evidence-based social intervention, a registered nurse holding undergraduate degrees from the University of Pennsylvania in nursing and health economics, with research interests in synthesis methods for complex psychosocial interventions and qualitative evidence, and geriatric mental health. Welcome, GJ.
Thanks, Anne. I'm very excited to be here with all of you today.
So to get started, we just wanted to review some things in the syllabus to clarify any questions anyone had, and we've been scanning, the whole team has been scanning the discussion forums for any questions. So to clarify a few things for everyone, in terms of the grading and the portfolio assignment. So the score that you need to achieve a statement of accomplishment is 8 points out of 12 points. We did include a quiz for week 0, which is brand new this run of Coursera, thanks to GJ, who was a teaching associate for us the last time the course ran, and we saw a need for some information regarding critical appraisal. So we added a quiz. The quiz has 4 questions. Each question is worth 1/4 of a point. You have 3 opportunities to take the quiz and gain 1 full point, and that is extra credit or bonus on top of the portfolio assignments. So please feel free to take the quiz, and it will be open the entire run of the course. And that is not included in the 12 points. Each portfolio assignment submission is worth a possible of 2 points, and there are 6 weeks of submissions. That's where the 12 points comes from. When grading or peer reviewing someone else's submission, we want this to be an open environment, and we understand that English is not everyone's first or even second language. So if there's some grammar issues, spelling mistakes, we're fine with that. It's about content and how the person responds to that portfolio item submission. So if you see value to that person in the submission and they meet a minimum word requirement, I believe we asked for around 250 words, we ask that you give them full credit for those submissions. You need to submit 5 peer reviews in order to gain your full points. So if you're reviewed and you receive a 2, you need to do the 5 submissions to get those 2 full points. If you don't, that's a 20% deduction for points for that week. So make sure to get those peer reviews in. Anything else from the tech team in terms of issues on Coursera related to the portfolio assignments? I think that was it. GJ, did you see any issues come up?
Not particularly, or at least nothing that you haven't already covered. And I know I'm certainly looking forward to seeing everyone's portfolio submissions over the course of this term.
Yes, and we also highly encourage people, if you do make any videos, please post them to YouTube and then link them to us. On the left-hand side of the screen on the menu, there's video perspectives. And we had so many people submit video perspectives and post them on YouTube, and we loved going through them last time the course ran that we decided to have a place, a repository for people to submit their own video perspectives so we can share them and further our discourse on global aging. So now I want to get to some questions that people have posted for us on the discussion forum. And if you have a question while you're watching this webcast, please go to discussion forum, week 1, and webcast. and submit your questions there, or you can tweet us at Old Globe MOOC, and we'll be answering your questions live. So, GJ, you ready for the first question?
I'm eagerly awaiting it.
So, Anonymous submitted a question. A concern I have about studies and how they are used is that there is a danger of people taking the norm or average response found in studies as the way it is, when in fact no one is average. We all have differences which do not fit the normal range. And the further we are from normal, the less likely the test results would be applicable to us. So this person's question is twofold. One, what cautions are in place or could be in place to prevent incorrect assessments on the basis of numbers? And two, are there ways that tests can be designed or assessed so that they can provide useful information which considers the responses of outliers, as well as the more average cohorts?
So that's a very insightful question to whomever submitted that. And I think there are a few things that I think are worth pointing out. The first is that the average is a notion that we see a lot in statistics, and the average is about is what we call a measure of central tendency, right? So the poster is correct that it does represent a specific group of people, strictly speaking, and it best represents those people who are close to the average. Now, there are a few things that are worth pointing out about this. The first is that if we're talking about an intervention, right, and preferably an intervention that we test in a randomized control trial. When we do a randomized control trial, we're randomizing people into the intervention group, the group that receives the treatment and the treatment that doesn't receive it. And what that allows us to say is at the population level, or at the group level, that the intervention causes the effect. Now, to a certain degree, that's a robust finding. And when we say robust, what we mean is that it's robust to the people who were contained in that population, and in the study sample, and the degree to which that study sample reflects the larger population. Now, that does speak to two very important issues. And the first one is what we would call generalizability of the study's findings. To what degree does what we know about the specific study sample reflect conclusions that we can draw as regards other samples of people who, as the questioner pointed out, may not necessarily be at the average. So it's a larger scale question that needs to be addressed. And I think that's one that you address through critical appraisal of both the studies that you're looking at, as well as the fit of that study to the particular population that you're trying to apply the study's findings to. Number one. Number two, I think your point about outliers, what we would call outliers, right, the people who are farthest away from the average, is a good one. That's one of the reasons why we can use several different advanced statistical methods to check if the effect or if the relationship is the same in all of what we would call subgroups. Okay, so this is definitely extra for experts, but in some cases we call it a moderator analysis. To what degree do certain characteristics of the person, how normal that person is, affect the relationship between one factor or another? So in terms of good research design, what you'd expect someone to do is to look at if there are any characteristics of the specific study sample that might affect the relationship between one characteristic and another. Should we go for an example, Anne?
I think so.
Okay. So here's an example. Let's say that we're looking at the relationship between spanking and later in life issues later in life in terms of child development, okay? Such as conduct disorders or other misbehavior or antisocial behavior. Now, the relationship between what we would call harsh parental discipline and better later life outcomes is moderated, right, is affected by ethnicity, okay? In some ethnic groups, consistent harsh parental discipline can actually be better associated, at least some studies suggest this, being better associated with better outcomes. In other ethnic groups, harsher parental discipline is not associated with that. So I think that's a very large-scale example of how differences between people can affect the relationships. And we would expect in an extremely well-designed study that they would consider what those possible characteristics might be.
So you're talking about, we also have to, when we're looking at a piece of information, we have to look at their study sample.
That's the key.
Is this study sample related to what we're trying to study specifically? And is it relatable to me as a person who's looking at this evidence and wants to apply it to my life?
And we talked about this pretty extensively in the critical appraisal interview video, which is the difference between so-called clinical samples in efficacy studies, right? We have a very specifically well-controlled sample, and so-called real-life trials where things are a lot messier. So in some ways, real-life evidence is more helpful because it includes more people who are quote-unquote not normal for the population. And in that regard, that evidence is more robust. So to answer the question about how can really good research reflect the need to consider this, the first is that really well-considered research should include subgroup or moderator analyses to look how the relationships are different between different groups of people, number one. And number two, effectiveness studies should consider real-world populations and look at how those real-world populations, what the evidence of the intervention effectiveness is in those real-world populations.
And you're talking about real-world populations and heterogeneity, making sure there's a good mix, not only based on things like ethnicity or cultural background, but also socioeconomic status, available resources.
Sure. Yeah, all these things are very important because the intervention could be differentially effective in different settings. And we call that heterogeneity of effectiveness, as you said.
All right. Fantastic. Thanks so much, DJ. Our next question comes from Bianca Hart, and she asked, what are some of the ways we can fight isolation and loneliness in our aging population? And I think this is a great question, and it's something that we discuss throughout the 6 weeks of Growing Old around the globe because there are so many different aspects to things like isolation and loneliness. A lot of the things we talk about include social and civic engagement and kind of the social construct of how we as a society isolate the elderly in the United States, in different European countries, in South America. There's all different ways of causing isolation for the elderly. There's somebody who's isolated because they live at home and they're the only person in the house. But there are people who live alone who don't feel lonely or socially isolated because they're engaged in politics, or they have a specific type of engagement within their religious group. But there's these things, this comes up a lot when we talk about things that we have in the United States called continuing care retirement communities. So different communities that you would enter into in your older years, maybe 60s, 70s, in which there is a specific group, age group, and usually socioeconomic group that you live with. And there's not much interaction with the greater community or the greater town. And we kind of fight with this idea of having a community of elders who can kind of support and lift each other up, but also isolating that community. This is great for the discussion forums to talk about how you engage regularly with people of different generations. There's also ways that we need to construct our communities or cities in order to make things more accessible to have toddlers, college students, middle-aged persons, and older people be able to gather in the same place. So how do we make our public spaces accessible? Is it easy for an elderly person to ride the bus to get to that park? When we advertise public works or something going on in the community, do you advertise it to small children and older adults?
So, Anne, I think you raise a very interesting point about the need for what we would call structural interventions to promote integration of older adults into our communities. When we talk about structural interventions, what we mean is these are not the sorts of interventions where you give services to someone out of hand, right? Or where you try and encourage them to change their behaviors. What we talk about when we talk about this is how do you change the context and the circumstances to make it easier for older adults to be integrated in their communities. And this was an issue that came up very early in last year's Old Globe course. People had a lot of thoughts about what makes cities and what makes communities hospitable places for older adults to live. I think certainly transport is a really important way to motivate efforts against what we would call social exclusion, so the integration of people in the community. Transport is very important. To what degree are our communities accessible? To what degree are there different resources available to older adults that encourages them to stay at home and to stay living independently in their communities? So thinking structurally, thinking about what we would call the built environment, how can we make places and communities more hospitable for older adults to reside in? Now, currently, there's actually not a whole lot of evidence on this subject. So I think the questioner, raises a really interesting point about a really interesting place of developing research at the moment. We're still trying to figure out how to make communities more hospitable. We don't know a lot, and I think, there's certainly several randomized control trials ongoing now trying to investigate how to make communities more hospitable to cause better social integration on the part of older adults.
This question also brought up a book that's on my reading list that I keep trying to get to, hopefully, going on vacation over the next couple weeks. So it's definitely on my must-read list. It's called Going Solo by Eric Kleinenberg, and really looks at people who live alone and are engaged, and this trend now of people across the lifespan of living alone. And I believe it's a series of interviews, so I think that's one thing. We're seeing a trend towards people living alone, but does that mean that they're isolated or lonely? Is it about being in a house with 5 generations, which if you live in places like West Philadelphia, where I was a nurse doing home care for a while, there's people of all generations living in one house, working together towards a common goal, constantly interacting, but they might feel lonely because they don't have someone of their own age. I think loneliness and isolation happens on an individual level a lot of times, and you really have to look at the person and see where their cultural values lie. In congruency with that, we had another question from an anonymous poster. What strategies are available or in use for hosting multi-generational events in which people of different generations gather together for learning, study, fellowship, community building, etc.? One place where this likely occurs is in family gatherings. But outside of that, what types of community activities exist? And I'll pose this to you. Massive open online courses. We have had students join us from their teenage years to well into their 90s, and they all come to the same discussion forums to talk about the same social issues. Politics in this country is another place where people of different generations tend to come together to discuss these things. Where have you seen some multi-generational events, GJ?
That's a good question. To be honest, given the kind of ecosystem I live in now, I haven't seen a whole lot of them, which is a shame. I think what's interesting, and I not to totally take the discussion in a perpendicular direction, but I was just thinking about a book I recently read called The Spirit Level. Have you heard of this book, The Spirit Level?
I have not.
Okay, so The Spirit Level by Pickett and Wilkinson actually advances a very interesting argument that goes back to several themes that came up earlier in our discussion. And the core of their assertion is that more equal societies live longer, have fewer, their older adults have fewer health problems, and communities where you have better community life, less violence, are all associated with communities that are more equal. So I think there's an important political and social aspect to this, in that communities that have, communities and countries more specifically, that fare better on measures of equality actually have older adults that live longer and are less sick. And so what's interesting about this very specifically is that if you look at the demographic trends over time, and I know this is something that will come up later in the Old Globe course, older adults have been living longer, and thus the overall rate of disability has increased. Now, why is that? It's because people are living longer, and so there's more time, essentially, for them to have some sort of disability as the time goes on. But what we're seeing is that the countries in which older adults live the longest are those countries where equality is strongest, where intergenerational bonding is strongest, and where intergenerational equity is also strongest. And so I think that's a very interesting point to keep in mind when we're comparing demographic regimes and demographic situations across countries and looking at the health of older adults. That more equal societies means healthier older adults.
So there's a lack of marginalization based on age.
Yeah, exactly. The less we marginalize older adults, and the more that we make community and community-based initiatives inclusive and reflective of the needs of older adults, we can be fairly confident that means that our older adults will live longer and healthier over time.
I think this brings up a good point. So in looking at the discussion forum where we talked about the age of 50 being this biological marker of the age, people kept talking about how they are 70 and they're not old.
Right.
So I think as our population ages and people who are engaged in these activities and engaged in government and their communities and societies, they're not going to see themselves as old or elderly. They're going to see themselves as an integral part of the community, which they are, and fashion these events and activities around their peers.
Right. A community has nothing to lose, and in fact it has everything to gain by being more inclusive of older adults and by attending to the concern of intergenerational equity. And I think that's something that we'll see emerging, to go back to this other point about structural interventions. That's something that I think will become more and more important as city planning advances as a field and as a discipline. And particularly the public health aspects of that, as those become clear as a discipline.
This also brings us to a question raised by another anonymous poster. What defines elderly? And they posted a story from NPR. Going to post in the bibliography and resources tab so everybody can take a look at it because I thought it was great, about this word elderly and how we use this word and the connotations that it has in terms of disability, frailty, and yet often we use the word elder to connote someone who is full of wisdom and to be respected. There's an interesting dichotomy there in that word alone, elderly. So in the article, they went to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, and it said someone who is old, older than middle age. So then that brings us to the question, as you talked about, GJ, we're living into our 80s and 90s. What's middle age now?
So what's interesting is that we used to think that the boundary for elderly has changed significantly, and I think we've also seen this in the field of biostatistics. Elderly used to be, like old, not even elderly, just old, used to be 65. Now it's 75, right? And so I think we're seeing this advance older and older and older. This is what we would call the rectangularization of life tables. So let me explain what that means. Before I go back to answer your question about what is middle age. When we talk about the rectangularization of life tables, what we're saying is that demographically, we have a situation where no one is dying until old age. And then within the space of like 5 years, everyone dies. So but what does that mean? What that means is that it used to be that if you look at the population, if you look at what we would call a birth cohort, if you look at all the people born in a specific year, 1 year from the date of their birth, it used to be that many of them will have died because of high infant mortality, right? Mm-hmm. Then you have a fairly steady decrease in the number of people left alive, and then finally by the time you get to 70, 75, no one's left, okay? Mm-hmm. Because of advances in health and technology, what we're seeing is that no one is dying until they get between the ages of 75 and 85. And in that very compressed time frame, that's when all the death happens, as it were. So to some degree, our definitions of middle-aged haven't really caught up with the rectangularization of this life table. And what that means is that the definition of middle age still is very dependent on the context and circumstances within which people live. So is there a definition for middle-aged? No, and that might be a good thing, because there might not be such a thing as middle-aged before, especially if no one is dying, right? Or at least no one is dying at younger ages. My best guess, heuristically, as it were, is that middle age is anywhere between 40 and 70. And I know I've probably offended a whole bunch of people now who are in their 40s and are like, I'm not middle-aged. Right, that's fine. But the point is that definitions of middle age will continue to grow and change, especially as we endure several additional demographic transitions in the developed world and in the developing world as well. Does that answer that question, or is there anything that wasn't clear there?
What I'm hearing is, as we've compressed this disability of being very old and subsequently deaths due to old age, we've also really expanded middle age and what middle age is.
Sure.
That's an interesting point, GJ. I think this term elderly has a lot of different factors. So you talked about the age of 65 and why was 65 elderly, or why do we think you're old when you hit 65? And there's this whole idea of when you retire. Mm-hmm. And in the United States, right now, that's around 65 years old is the age of retirement. But then you look at things like AARP. So that was originally the American Association of Retired Persons, which they don't even explain. That's the old definition of it. Now it's AARP. And at 50 years old, in the mail in the United States, you get a letter and says, sign up for your AARP benefits, and now you're a senior citizen. So you've reached this status of being the highest level of citizen, which is interesting. Now, AARP is associated with aging in this country, an older age, but at 50 years old, you can sign up. At 65, we retire, and now at 75, we're old. So what does the word elderly really mean?
I don't think anyone knows, to be honest. And I think that we're still trying to figure out how different demographic trends will shake out around the world before we can really decide what old is.
And in the discussion forums, it really seems like old is not a title or definition, but how one feels about themselves. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, this word old is often associated with things like social isolation, depression, cognitive changes like dementia, or other disabilities that happen when you get into old age. And it's something that here at Growing Old Around the Globe, we're trying to separate the negative connotations of aging with the word old, or how the media and other sources have portrayed the older adult.
Mm-hmm.
So we did have a few other questions that are just coming in. An anonymous post. So what are some of the major challenges of aging for ethnic minorities in the U.S.?
Sorry, can you ask that one more time, please?
Sure. Major challenges of aging for ethnic minorities in the United States.
What are the challenges in aging for ethnic minorities in the United States? Well, I think one of the biggest ones, of course, is the challenge of the link between ethnic status and poor health status in older age. Now, what does that mean? As I said before, and I will say this again, correlation is not causation. So just because being of a particular ethnic status means that you have differential risk for certain chronic illnesses doesn't necessarily mean that being of that ethnic status causes certain chronic diseases. Now, that doesn't change the fact that in older adults, we're facing significant issues in terms of the management of chronic and non-communicable diseases, whether that's heart disease, whether that's type 2 diabetes. And in my opinion, the other big issue that I don't think we've adequately addressed has been geriatric mental health issues. As you might get, of course I think that's an issue because this is what I study, but naturally I think that we need to more meaningfully attend to the challenges of community-based geriatric mental health care, especially as we have more older adults living at home. And we need to pay attention to the specific ramifications of that in older adults who are ethnic minorities, because of the unique and intersecting issues that put them at greater risk for other chronic diseases as well. What do you think about that, Anne?
I completely agree. I think, especially in terms of geriatric mental health, a lot of geriatric mental health issues people assume are normal aspects of aging and therefore go untreated and compound and worsen other chronic health issues.
Sorry, go ahead.
Nope. All you, Gija.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that I think access to healthcare is a major issue, and specifically access to healthcare for older adults that understands the specific position in which they find themselves. One of the greatest triumphs, in my view, of modern nursing has been attention to gerontological nursing. And as a gerontological nurse, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, that I think that's been one of the major triumphs of American nursing in recent years. But that doesn't mean that the challenge is done. I think it still means that there's a lot to be done in terms of addressing how to provide culturally relevant and sensitive care to older adults that addresses their specific issues in the home context.
I also think nurses have been integral in addressing the mistrust that developed over many years of maybe some misguided medicine and different issues we've had in medical research in our past in relation to ethnic minorities. If anyone's ever seen or heard of the book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, it talks a lot about the issues of how ethnic minorities were treated as research subjects in U.S. history. And now I think even still, so the people who are aging now have memories of this time, maybe in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, where ethnic minorities in this country were not given full disclosure or full rights when becoming a part of a research trial, and created mistrust in general in healthcare and nursing. And we're still trying to break that down. So even in some places where there is access to healthcare for these aging ethnic minorities, there might not be that trusting relationship between the healthcare entity and the individual.
Mm-hmm. And I think to relate to all of these things, I think a common theme, and something that I'm sure will come up next week, is the importance of healthcare systems that allow for the coordination of care across multiple providers. One thing that we're seeing now in older adults, especially as they're living longer, right, as we have this rectangularization of mortality rates, one thing that we're seeing now is that we have more older adults living with more chronic disabilities per person.
Mm-hmm.
So how is this care being coordinated across different providers, addressing different parts of the same person? And so developing healthcare systems, and I think this is one of the promises of healthcare reform that I'll definitely have my eye out to see if it's fulfilled, is a degree to which what some people might call medical homes, what other people would call care coordinators, case managers, to what degree are we able to provide older adults with multiple comorbid disabilities, multiple disabilities that occur together, with the care they need to make sure that all their issues are being coordinated. Let me give you an example from my own clinical practice. Something that, and this is an example that I think highlights the need to consider the multiple domains of people's lives in their care. A few years ago, I saw a patient who was fired from his job because he had a positive urine test for marijuana, despite the fact that he had sworn to us he was not smoking marijuana. When we looked at his records, one of the things we realized was that one of his HIV medications actually was known to cause positive marijuana urine tests, even if the person hadn't smoked anything. And this would cause this person severe employment difficulties in that regard. Now, it's a bit of a leap, but I think it's important to consider the multiple facets of people's lives and the degree to which care and clinical care understands that. And that's especially important for older adults who are increasingly managing more and greater obligations to themselves, to their families, and to their communities, while at the same time, on average, handling more non-communicable diseases and more morbidities and disabilities than in the past.
That's a great point, GJ. And I think that also this discussion is leading up to this question. We have a couple questions that we can kind of touch on, but we'll really get to further in the Coursera course. Around week 3 is a lot when we talk about things like national healthcare programs in the U.S., Medicare and Medicaid. But Gail Francis writes us a question. Aging of the global population, particularly in the U.S., is frequently described as a major liability and problem. Why is there little conversation about the assets this population will be contributing to the commons? Research shows that there are increasing demands on medical resources across the board, not exclusively from aging populations. The budget in the Python has been occurring since 1964. Why is this suddenly a horror story?
So I love that image of the budge and the python. Yeah. So I think that person deserves special credit. Yeah, budge and the python. Why is it now a horror story? I think that's a very good question. This is not a course about political science, but I don't think it's too hard to see why critical planning has not been a feature of our country's healthcare system in recent years. But part of it is also not only the inertia, but also realizing that things aren't problems until they become problems. And that's why it's now a problem. So what does that mean? We're just now beginning to see the challenges that this poses to us. And I think that's why it's now, as has been said, a horror story. I also think you're right. I think the questioner is right about appreciating what older adults have to bring. I don't think that's a very well-developed theme in gerontology, or at least a practice of gerontology. And Anne, I'd be certainly curious to hear what your thoughts are about ways in which older adults could be meaningfully integrated in terms of what they have to bring to their community. So
this will come up a lot throughout the 6 weeks of the course about the assets of this population, especially in different employment fields. So at 65, the expectation is retirement. And someone who's been working full-time since their late teens, early 20s, or been in school and working full-time since their late teens, early 20s. And there's such a wealth of experience and information and knowledge in this population that really has been going untapped for decades. And there's a lot of talk throughout this course about how to use the older population or the elderly as assets in these ways. And that's really a goal of Growing Old around the globe, is to start the discussion about older adults as assets to our communities and societies. What GJ was talking about before is a lot of times in the US, especially younger people, talk about older adults as a drain on society, on government funds, and yet on a personal level, you value your parents and your grandparents and other aging people. As you age, you want people to respect your experience in a certain field and your knowledge, and you look at the drain of Medicare and all these dollars and saying things like we should cut off funding for certain things. We'll talk about things like age cutoffs for surgical interventions. People will talk about age cutoffs or things like how they were treated maybe in a certain medical office when they found out they had a new, maybe not curable, but treatable disease that was extremely costly, and how they personally felt about being maybe talked to as if, what's the point? You're 82 years old. Why do you want this treatment? Or that it's a drain on society for you to get certain things. So it's something we'll discuss a lot more as the course goes on. And this kind of separation from the younger population that's paying into Social Security and the population that is now receiving their Social Security benefits in this country. And it's creating an interesting tug of war, where really there are many assets to having our older population be more integrated into the workforce and into our society. And we talk about it. Take a look, especially at things like Herb's interview, Skip's interview, Michael Deli Carpini's interview. It'll really shed some light on this. In addition, I do want to address, we got a question from an anonymous poster about hepatitis C, breakthroughs in drugs to treat hepatitis C, and how do policymakers address issues related to treatment for those on Medicare in the U.S. where cost of expensive drug treatments might have a major financial impact upon the financial viability of the entire system. And again, we'll address this question and we'll revisit Gail's question in the next webcast on June 11th, so make sure to tune in for that. All right, so Gigi, I wanted to end with a little sample portfolio project assignment for you. So let's say I am the participant that is going to submit a portfolio. So I was reading the Wall Street Journal a couple months ago, and I came across an article about advancing paternal age causing issues related to mental health and school performance in their children. And it was an interesting article, but I moved on. And then I watched the videos for Growing Old Around the Globe, week 1, and it came back with this discussion about being biologically old in this age of 50. So I went back to the article, and it's not open public access. So I listened to your advice, GJ's advice. I wanted to go to the source. I did notice in both the Wall Street Journal and in the New York Times, they use that key phrase, "a new study shows."
Yeah.
So I went to the source, and I don't have access to the source. But I did write up on my portfolio assignment. I created a link to the article on both Wall Street Journal and the New York Times discussing advanced paternal age, about mental illness risk higher for children of older fathers.
Mm-hmm.
And as someone who is not thinking about having children in the near future because of work and other obligations and possibly schooling, my thoughts are, I never thought having a partner who was older would affect the health of my unborn child. And it's now making me think about things like the age at which I want to have children. So I write commentary on it and I submit it, and then GJ, you're my peer reviewer. What do you think about that?
So I think the first thing I'd do is I would have a careful read of what you've had to say on the subject, and I think I would note with appreciation your efforts to go to the abstract of the article and to really go deep, check under the hood to make sure what's going on. And also, of course, your similar opinion to my own, that the phrase "a new study shows" is not a good phrase. Okay, no. So, no, you should not mark portfolios based on the degree to which you agree with them. Let me make that very clear. But I would note with appreciation the effort that you, I think, very clearly showed in going deep and thinking critically about what's going on. I think the other thing that I would be very interested in is how you've taken stock of how aging, and in this particular case, the age of your partner, the paternal age, right? How the age of your partner would influence the health of your potential future children. But also, I think, how you might have engaged with that by using some of the tools and ideas and concepts that have been reflected in the course. So I think that's very important. So I think in that respect, I would note those things with appreciation, and then I'd offer maybe my own thoughts on it, right? Which is that perhaps I myself should start thinking about my own biological clock as it's ticking, right? But more specifically, that the issues that this might pose on a larger scale for more and different types of families, especially as we see different types of non-traditional families come to the forefront in our growing and evolving society. Now, from a critical appraisal perspective, I think I'd note with interest that the article was what we would call a cohort study. So this is a type of study. In the critical appraisal video, we presented that there are 4 basic types of studies, right? Studies that describe a problem using numbers, studies that describe a problem using people's experiences, studies that tell you how much something costs, and studies that are experiments, right, that tell you if something works or not. In this case, this is a study that tells us what a problem is using numbers. But it's a very interesting type of study in that it's what's called a cohort study. So in this particular case, they followed a group of people, in this case a group of children, over time, and followed them up repeatedly over time to see what the incidence, right, what the rate of occurrence was of specific issues. In this case, it was psychological morbidity, i.e. different mental illnesses, and academic morbidity, i.e. were they failing in school or not. And what they did was that they checked whether or not the age the father was at the time that the child was born influenced those longer-term outcomes. Now, what does that mean? It's interesting because this particular study gets us a little bit closer to allowing us to make causal inference, right? The ability to link cause and effect than just a cross-sectional study, something that looks for correlations between one factor and another. And the reason for that is because in this case, paternal age necessarily precedes the outcome that we're looking at. So it gets us a little bit closer to being able to make that causal inference, but not 100% of the way there. Just a little bit closer. And so I would be interested to see if additional studies are able to replicate this finding in different study samples. Based on my own reading of the abstract, it looks like they were only looking at individuals born in Sweden between 1973 and 2001. But I would be interested also in looking at, I would also be interested in looking at studies in other populations. Now, there are other interesting things about this study, including, for example, that they did what's called a quasi-experimental design. So they found different ways to compare and combine different people by matching them closely with other very similar people. So in that sense, it's even that way just a little bit more closer to causal inference, but not 100% of the way there. And so I think it'll be interesting to see if other studies bear out these findings. Again, replicability and reproducibility in other samples.
So how many points do I get on my portfolio project?
You get all the points, Anne.
Points.
All the points. Yes.
All right.
Because, of course, you took apart what was being said, you reflected it, you shared your own thoughts on it, and there was evidence of having actually done the thinking. Even if I didn't agree with all that you said, there was definitely evidence of having done the thinking and having, put in the brain power to understanding the problem.
And that's exactly what we want all of our old Globers, as we call our participants, to do. To take a look at the evidence or take a look at what's out there in front of you. It doesn't have to be evidence. It could be an example of older adults in your community, a sign that you see or a poster that sparks some interest in you, and take it a step further. Examine it from different perspectives. How do you feel about that piece of information? How does it relate to aging? And how does it relate to question of the week? And if you want to go ahead and try out some critical appraisal, we highly encourage it. And I know GJ is going to be scanning those portfolio assignments, so he would love to see some critical appraisal going on out there.
I would like nothing more.
So we will continue to be posting on our Twitter account at Old Globe Moog and on our Facebook page. So please check those out over the next 2 weeks until we can see you again at our next webcast, in which Sarah will definitely be joining us on June 11th at 10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And we wanted to thank GJ very much for joining us all the way from the UK. And we will definitely hope to see you soon, GJ.
My pleasure, and thanks a lot, Anne.
All right, take care, everyone. Until then.